I'm very happy to welcome Edward Underhill to our Bookish Resistance Club. Edward has a few books out, but today we are going to talk mostly about his latest one, the In-Between Bookstore. So we're going to start with the In-Between Bookstore, which honestly, it sounds like such a lovely story. And if you wouldn't mind sharing, what was the inspiration for that?
Sure. So The In-Between Bookstore is my adult fiction debut. It just came out in January. And it is about a trans man who is sort of on the cusp of turning 30 and is kind of having a quarter life crisis. So he's living in New York City and he's just lost his job and he's starting to wonder if he really belongs there. And so when he finds out his mom is moving, she's downsizing, still lives in the same small town in Illinois where he grew up, he decides to go back and help her downsize. And while he's there, he walks into the bookstore that he used to work at in high school. And when he walks in, he enters a time slip and encounters a pre-transition teenage version of himself. So it's sort of the book version of if you could ask your younger self anything, what would it be? And that's kind of where the inspiration for it came from. I sort of remember a number of years ago, before Twitter became X and a raging hellscape, I remember seeing this question going around in the way that like some of these viral questions do on social media. Um, and it was really, some people said very silly things like, oh, I tell my younger self the winning lottery numbers, right? But it was interesting to me to see how many queer and trans people responded with, like, I would tell my younger self, we're gay, we're trans, we're going to be okay. Um, because I definitely had that thought myself, but I didn't sort of realize or think about how universal that was. Um, so yeah, so I kind of started crafting the story around that, and a bookstore just kind of seemed to be, in some ways, a very natural place for that kind of character transformation to take place. That they always feel a little bit magical to me. Like I love the feeling of just sort of getting lost in the back of a bookstore and you're not quite sure what time it is or what day it is, but there's just all these stories on the shelf and you sort of feel like the possibility of all those stories.
Yeah, there's no clocks anywhere. It's like a casino, but way better. And
Yeah.
uh, I actually worked at a bookstore and I met so many amazing authors. This was like years ago when I was still in California. Um, there is a magic that is within a bookstore, the endless stories, seeing somebody look at a book that you've read and connecting with them and all of that. And right now, there is very much a viral question, as you mentioned, there's a trend where people are going, oh, I took my younger self out to coffee, and this is what we
Yeah.
talked about.
Right,
And
right.
yeah, so I mean, you were kind of prescient in that sense because it's very, very timely. Um, what was your journey like? I mean, this is not your first published book, but what was your journey to becoming a published author like?
So I've been writing for a really long time. I think I wrote my first very, very bad novel when I was probably like 14. Um, and I sort of kept writing all through high school. I think I got a little bit better. I actually had an agent interested in a novel when I was about 22, sort of in grad school. And at that time, there really wasn't like any space in publishing hardly for trans voices. So I wasn't really out. I mean, I was trans. I presented as male, but I was sort of stealth because that's what it felt like you needed to be at that point. This was in 2010.
Yeah.
Um, so I came out in 2009, much like Darby does in the book. And it was just like it was a very different time. You didn't have the sort of huge social media presences of queer and trans people that you do now. You don't see the visibility just wasn't there in the same way. And publishing was really only just starting to make space for queer voices at all. Um, so I was writing queer fiction, but not about trans characters. And I had an agent interested in a book, and he was like, "Well, I think it needs some work. You need to like fix these things." And when I looked at it more, I just sort of felt like, yeah, this isn't ready. I don't think this is ready, and I don't feel ready. And I think in retrospect, I'm very glad I made that decision. And then fast forward about it, like several years later, I sort of was pursuing a career in music and spent a lot of time doing that, but I kind of kept writing in the background. Um, and then in the wake of the 2016 election, I decided I want to try again. And I started writing trans characters kind of out of spite. I had like just started to see that publishing was starting to do more queer stuff. There was starting to be trans books. And it was really in the young adult sphere. I think YA has often been on the cutting edge of some of this stuff in terms of representation. So that's what I started writing. That YA has always had a special place in my heart, and I wanted to write a book about trans joy, sort of out of spite. And then that ended up being the book that got me my agent and then got me a book deal. And so I wrote two trans YA, joyful romances, basically. And I hadn't really thought about writing for adults. I love writing for teenagers. They're big and messy, and that's like so much fun to write. But I had an editor that I had worked with on the YA say, like, well, would you think about writing an adult book? Because um, she was sort of pointing out there's a little bit of a gulf where there isn't really a lot of fiction that's for readers in their 20s and 30s that sort of reflects a lot of, I think, what the millennial and Gen Z experience is now. And some of that is experiences like queer experiences, that those voices just aren't there, or BIPOC voices aren't there as much. Some of it is, I think, a little bit deeper than that, of like, well, where is the representation of the generation that graduated with a bunch of student loans that isn't going to have the sort of typical, I think, life path that you see represented in what I would call book club fiction a lot. Um, so I sort of like was like, oh, that actually is like really interesting, because a lot of my friends still read YA because that's where we see ourselves represented more. And so it actually ended up being really fun then to sort of take on the challenge of like, can I write a book that's for where me and my friends are now, basically. And then that became the In-Between Bookstore.
Kind of funny that you mentioned that you started writing after the 2016 election, because the idea for the Bookish Resistance was born the day after the 2024 election. I woke up and
Yeah,
was devastated, and I didn't know what to do. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to read more, diverse, more queer, more BIPOC, more disabled authors. And my friend had a brilliant idea. He's like, why don't you do a book club? And I'm like,
yeah,
that is perfect, because then you share that with others. It's not just about what I read. It's, look, here, there's these amazing voices, and you should read them, and you should, become immersed in their worlds. And, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. Um, who inspires you? Not just because I know you're a composer too.
I am.
Yeah. So who inspires you? I mean, either in writing or in music, who do you turn to for inspiration?
It's sort of funny. I feel like the I've gotten asked the question so many times, like, "Oh, who are your favorite authors? What are your favorite books?" I sort of feel like I find it a little bit everywhere, that it can sometimes be a piece of music. I do listen to music a lot when I write, and uh I really feel like to sort of crack open the heart of a story, I need to find like the perfect piece of music to listen to do that. So I'll often put together playlists that gives me a lot of inspiration. Um, and I do think like I'll find individual books here and there, and sometimes I'll follow an author to other books, and sometimes that book will just be like that particular one just hits for me. Um, so I remember like, I feel like I can sort of trace influences on my writing to a few books like that. One of them being A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, which also has really, really beautiful illustrations. And that one, I think, just taught me the power of extremely simple lines delivered really, really effectively. Um, And I remember also reading Lily and the Octopus by Stephen Rowley, which was pretty much the first time I'd read an adult fiction book that felt very, I mean, it is kind of literary. It gets a little weird, but it also felt very commercial and like upmarket in this way that I wanted the In-Between Bookstore to be. And that was the first time that I had read a book like that that featured a gay character where the book was not really about the fact that he's gay. It's just part of who he is, and it's actually about, you know, his sort of midlife crisis and the fact that he's losing his dear dog in the middle of it and all of this sort of stuff. And that really, I think, was one of the first things I read that made me feel like, oh, I maybe there is space to write the kind of fiction that I really love writing, which is very high concept, which is sort of very commercial and mainstream in a lot of ways, but just happens to have queer and trans characters in it.
I think that, you know, a lot of writers right now that are from marginalized groups are looking for that same space. And, you know, the thing is, we have to make the space if the space isn't there. Because, you know, very little is given for free, especially with this, you know, circus in the White House. And, um, you know, it's just so important to have, you know, I went through my Greco-Roman, you know, phase when I was little, and it was like, okay, I know all the Greek gods and I know all the Roman
Right.
gods and blah, 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 blah.
That
And
feels like a rite of passage, practically. I went through that.
right? Right. Everybody goes through that. And then it's the tutors, and then it's, you know,
Yeah.
um, and then you know, when I started reading more diversely, I was like, I've been limiting myself because there is beautiful mythology everywhere, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, that was part of why this, you know, book club started. But um going back to the way you work, what kind of music do you create?
So I have generally worked in film and TV. That was kind of my focus, I think, because I love telling stories, right? And so it was like that was the sort of the way to do it with music. So I've worked on it's been a lot of animation, actually. I've done some things for Disney. Um, uh, yeah, so like a lot of animated shows. I primarily write orchestral music. That's kind of my background is in orchestral classic stuff and classical stuff, and I grew up playing the cello. So yeah, it's kind of been all over the place. I think when I was a younger writer, I didn't think of stories as being malleable that way, and that's been like something that I think actually like being able to do music has kind of flowed over into my writing in that way of like seeing something as much more flexible.
That's very cool. I absolutely love most genres of music. I used to sing. I used to be a high soprano. Not anymore. I can't reach those notes. But um, music is such a powerful, I feel, tool. I mean, there are songs that I can't listen to. I absolutely cannot listen to, or I end up, you know, a wad of gum on the floor. And you know, there is music that just lifts you up, and you know, I can see how that would translate from one to the other, where you don't attach so much to each piece. And when your editor comes back and tells you, oh, you know, can we move this here? Can we take this out? It's, you know, it's more about the big picture for you. Um,
Yeah, and actually, like my first three YA books all have music in them in some capacity. So the first one, Always the Almost, is about a trans pianist in a competition. The second one is about marching band kids. And the third one that's coming out in May is sort of about these two kids who are like huge fans of this particular pop music group. So it's like I kind of ended up, pulling on some of that knowledge a little bit too, which was really fun. And that was actually like an unexpected joy of writing that first book that was about the trans pianist, like just how many classical musicians wrote to me and were like, I've never seen like this kind of portrayal in a book. So that was fun too.
that is so cool. Yeah, my husband, he used to play for Santa Clara Vanguard, which is a drum and bugle corps. thing. And the thing those kids go through in like, college marching bands or high school marching bands,
It's
like,
intense.
you insane? And how much do you get paid? No, he's like, no, we pay. We
Yeah.
pay to like go do this crazy stuff and sleep on, gym floors.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah, no, but I love that. What do you find that you're a very organized writer or more like a pantser, like they say?
I, it's funny. When I did the first draft of like what ended up being my first published book, I was absolutely pantsing my way through it. Like I knew more or less like, okay, well, I'm crafting this uh book sort of both around a romance and around a competition. So I sort of know the various points of that I have to hit. But everything else, I was like, I don't know. I write something and then we'll see if it works. I think being a published author and having that become more of a career made me learn to plan because it gets, for me at least, it got increasingly harder to totally pants my way through things. Because you'll sell a book on proposal, and in that case, rather than writing the whole book, you write the first 50 pages, say, and then you write the publisher a synopsis. And so it's like you better really know what's going to happen at the end of that book than if you're writing a synopsis. Um, and now I think I can't work any other way. It feels a little bit like, having headlights instead of just driving totally in the dark. You kind of have a sense of where you're going. And I don't necessarily know every nuanced detail. I don't necessarily know every single conversation that's going to happen on the page. I don't know every single emotional beat, but I have a sense of where the story is headed and sort of what the point is and what the internal conflicts for the characters are and sort of the driving tension of the whole thing. Um, and at this point, like just sort of, I think for my own time and efficiency, I basically don't start writing anything without talking to my agent about it first. I'll usually sort of send her a pitch for something, and if she likes that, then I'll, write the full synopsis and we'll kind of go from there. Um, and I find that has ended up working for me. And I still occasionally like I wrote parts of the In-Between Bookstore out of order. I don't know why the time travel book was like the one that I needed to write out of order. Um, but I sort of I feel like I have a plan, and then that plan is also flexible, kind of day to day. And sometimes I'll get halfway through the book and realize that something in the plan was wrong and I need to change it. But it does feel like you have a path, you like know the trail that you're trying to take, and then occasionally take a detour.
That's the fun in life, right? So speaking of the path that you're on, after the In-Between Bookstore, what is next for you?
So the immediate next thing is my third young adult book, which is another YA romance that is about two trans boys who are moving in opposite directions across the country. And they sort of meet by chance in Nebraska and have sort of an epic night of hanging out. They don't trade phone numbers, and the next day they can't find each other. And so the rest of the book is sort of about them trying to find their way back to each other. It's called In Case You Read This, and it comes out in May.
Cool.
And then I am working on another adult book. I feel like I can't say too much about it because it hasn't been announced yet, but it will be coming out theoretically in summer of 2026. So there will be another trans queer speculative novel coming from me at some point.
Yay! Very excited for both of those titles. And um, something that I ask every author, what advice would you give to somebody starting out, somebody who's not published yet? Um, what advice would you give them in order to support their career?
Yeah. Um, I always hesitate to give too much concrete advice because in some ways I think everyone's path is so different and what works for one person may not work for somebody else. And also there's like so much like you can just find so many good answers on the internet now. I mean, you can't trust everything, but there's a lot more than there used to be. I will say I think for me, the thing that I have relied on the most is right out of spite. And especially with the current administration that we have, with everything going on, with the increasing book bans, with the pressures on the publishing industry that are absolutely making it harder for querying authors, for authors on submission, um, that is the thing that has gotten me through. Of like, I can be sad about a rejection, I can be sad about something happening in the state of the world, but I generally manage to turn that into a sort of feeling of like, well, fine, I'm going to do this anyway. I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make it so good you can't say no. Um, and that's worked for me. And it doesn't always mean that I'm writing angry stories. I'm frequently not writing angry stories at all, but it's kind of holding on to that feeling of I'm going to do this anyway, and I'm going to do it really, really well. Um, I think that because that's like, even once you get a book published, the rejections don't stop there. Even once you get a few books published, we're now looking at more book bans for marginalized authors than we ever have before. There's absolutely now starting to be the backlash of like, seeing these voices as more and more niche and not something that belongs in the mainstream. So just being able to have that level of persistence, I think, to just keep going, go out of spite, make yourself angry, like whatever it is to keep writing. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's an absolute disgrace right now. And well, we're gonna end this on a positive note. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening in the West Coast, not here where it was, -17 last week, but that's all right. That's all right.
That Midwest weather.
I love it though. It's okay. My youngest, he still loves the snow. He still thinks everything is magical and everything. So I love to, sort of see it through his eyes as
Okay.
best I can. But yes, so you guys need to check out the In-Between Bookstore by Edward Underhill. And he has a couple more books coming out, and we will list that as well. And again, thank you so much, and best of luck with everything.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I
Of
really appreciate
course. You take care.